October 1939, Washington, D.C. General George Marshall sits alone in his office at the War Department. On his desk lies a list, 600 names, 600 officers, colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, men who have dedicated their entire adult lives to the United States Army, men who have served for 20, 30 years, men with families, men with pensions just years away, men who trust that their service, their sacrifice, their loyalty will be honored. Marshall picks up his pen. He begins marking names, one by one. Strike through, strike through, strike through. Each mark ends a career. Each mark breaks a promise the Army made decades ago. Stay loyal, work hard, wait your turn, and you'll be rewarded. Marshall is breaking that promise systematically, deliberately, without apology. His hand doesn't shake. His jaw is set. Because George Marshall knows something these 600 officers don't know yet, something the American public doesn't know, something even President Roosevelt doesn't fully understand. The United States is about to enter a war unlike anything in human history, a war of tanks and aircraft and mechanized infantry moving at speeds that would have been unthinkable just 20 years ago. A war where the old methods, the old tactics, the old ways of thinking will get thousands of American boys killed. And these 600 officers on this list, they can't fight that war. They're too old, too set in their ways, too married to cavalry charges and trench warfare and tactics from a conflict that ended 21 years ago. So Marshall makes his marks. 600 careers, 600 men who will hate him, 600 families who will call him ruthless, heartless, a destroyer of the Army. But if Marshall doesn't do this, if he lets these men lead American soldiers into combat against the German Wehrmacht, those soldiers will die. Not hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. So he keeps marking names, because sometimes the most important decision a leader can make is deciding who shouldn't lead anymore. This is the story of how one general destroyed an army to save it, how he purged 600 officers and replaced them with men nobody had heard of, how he gambled everything on a group of colonels and lieutenant colonels who would either win the greatest war in history or lose it catastrophically, and how that gamble, that brutal, career-destroying, reputation-shattering gamble, won World War II. My name is Jim Patterson. I'm 76 years old. My father was a sergeant in Patton's Third Army. He landed in France 3 weeks after D-Day, fought through the Ardennes, crossed the Rhine, and came home in 1904 with a Bronze Star and memories that gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. He told me stories about the war, about the cold, about the fear, about friends who didn't come home. But there's one story he never told me because he never knew it himself. The story of why his officers were so good, why his division commanders made smart decisions, why the generals leading American forces seemed to understand modern warfare in ways the Germans didn't expect. The reason was George Marshall. And what Marshall did in 1939 and 40 is a story most Americans have never heard. It's not taught in schools. It's not in the popular histories. But it's one of the most important decisions made during World War II. A decision made before America even entered the war. A decision that determined whether we would win or lose. So, let me take you back. Back to September 1st, 1980, the day that changed everything. September 1st, 1980, two decisions were made that would alter the course of human history. One started World War II, the other would end it. That morning, Adolf Hitler sent the Wehrmacht crashing into Poland. German panzers rolled across the border. Luftwaffe bombers darkened the sky. Europe had plunged into its Second World War in a single generation. Britain and France declared war on Germany. 2 days later, the world held its breath. Several hours after Hitler invaded Poland, several time zones away, President Franklin Roosevelt made a quiet announcement. He had selected a new chief of staff for the United States Army. The name surprised almost everyone, General George Catlett Marshall. Not the obvious choice, not even close. Roosevelt had bypassed 34 more senior officers to pick him, 34 generals who technically outranked Marshall in seniority, officers who had waited longer in line, officers who believed the position belonged to them by right of service time. Major General Hugh Drum was the favorite for the job. He had held almost every top position in the Army below Chief of Staff. He had been recommended repeatedly since 1930. His supporters were shocked. His allies were furious. Who was George Marshall? He was practically unknown outside military circles. He had spent most of his career in staff positions, planning operations, organizing logistics. He had never commanded troops in actual combat. He was 58 years old and had only made brigadier general 3 years earlier. But Roosevelt saw something others missed. Marshall had integrity. He spoke truth to power. He didn't play political games. During one meeting with the president in November 1938, Roosevelt asked Marshall if he agreed with a proposal to build 10,000 aircraft. Marshall looked at the president and said one word, no. He explained exactly why the proposal was wrong. Roosevelt's advisors were horrified. You don't contradict the president like that, not in front of other people, not so bluntly. Marshall didn't care. He wasn't there to tell Roosevelt what he wanted to hear. He was there to tell him what he needed to know. Roosevelt's colleagues thought Marshall had just ended his career. Instead, 10 months later, Roosevelt made him chief of staff, maybe despite that moment, maybe because of it. When Marshall walked into his new office on September 1st, 1930, he inherited an army that barely deserved the name. The United States Army ranked 19th in the world, behind Portugal, just ahead of Bulgaria. Total strength, 190,000 men. The New York City Police Department had more officers than the entire United States Marine Corps. Equipment from World War I still filled the warehouses. Rifles were in short supply. Tanks were scarce. During recent exercises, the Army had trained with wooden rifles and trucks labeled tank. It was, as one observer put it, all bone and no muscle. Marshall looked at this skeleton force and saw an impossible task ahead. War was coming, not just to Europe, eventually to America. When it arrived, the United States would need an army 10 times larger than what existed, an army of 2 million men, maybe more, an army that could fight mechanized warfare against the Wehrmacht, an army that didn't exist. And standing between Marshall and that army were hundreds of officers who would never be able to lead it. The problem wasn't disloyalty. It wasn't cowardice. It was age, exhaustion, and obsolescence. The Army ran on a seniority system that promoted officers based purely on time in service. You didn't advance because you were good. You advanced because you were patient, because someone ahead of you died or retired. Officers could spend 15 years as a captain, 20 years as a major. Colonels in their 60s commanded regiments they could barely keep up with physically. Marshall himself had experienced this system. He had been a colonel in World War I. After the war ended, he was reduced to his peacetime rank of captain. He spent 15 more years before becoming a colonel again. More than 1,000 officers of appropriate age and experience for lieutenant colonel were still captains in 1939. They weren't stuck because they had failed. They were stuck because the system didn't promote based on ability. It promoted based on waiting. Some of these officers were brilliant. Others were mediocre. Many were simply too old, in their 50s and 60s, set in their thinking, trained to fight the last war. They knew cavalry charges and trench warfare. They didn't know blitzkrieg. They didn't know combined arms operations. They didn't understand that warfare had fundamentally changed. Germany had just demonstrated what modern war looked like. Poland fell in 4 weeks, not 4 years like World War I. 4 weeks. Tanks broke through defensive lines. Dive bombers destroyed supply columns. Infantry couldn't keep up. Cavalry was slaughtered. Everything the old officers knew was obsolete. Marshall needed to build an army that could fight this new kind of war. In October 1939, 1 month after taking command, Marshall spoke bluntly to his staff. I'm going to read you his exact words. The present general officers of the line are, for the most part, too old to command troops in battle under the terrific pressure of modern war. Most of them have their minds set in outmoded patterns and can't change to meet the new conditions they may face if we become involved in the war that started in Europe. He was describing his own officer corps, men he had served with for decades, men who had dedicated their lives to the Army, men who would be utterly destroyed by modern combat. Marshall didn't enjoy saying it, but he needed Congress to hear it. He needed Roosevelt to understand if the Army went to war with its current leadership, it would lose, not might lose, would lose. The Germans would cut through American divisions like paper, and thousands of American boys would die because their generals didn't understand how to fight anymore. So Marshall had a plan. He had been keeping notes for years. During his time as assistant commandant at the infantry school at Fort Benning in the 1930s, he had watched hundreds of young officers go through training. He noted which ones showed promise, which ones thought creatively, which ones could handle pressure, which ones led men well. The legend says he kept a little black book with names of officers he believed in. Whether the physical book existed or not, Marshall definitely kept mental notes. He knew who the talented officers were. The problem was getting them into positions where they could actually lead. The seniority system blocked them. A brilliant lieutenant colonel couldn't jump ahead of 20 mediocre colonels. It didn't matter how good he was. He had to wait. And waiting meant that by the time he got his chance, he might be too old himself, or the war might be over or lost. In the spring of 1940, everything changed. Germany launched its attack on France. The Wehrmacht broke through French lines at the Ardennes, supposedly impassable terrain. Panzers raced to the coast. France, which had held off Germany for 4 years in World War I, collapsed in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The British barely escaped at Dunkirk. The German military machine looked unstoppable. Congress suddenly became very interested in what Marshall had been saying about preparedness. The Selective Training and Service Act passed in September 1940, America's first peacetime draft. The Army would grow. New divisions would form. But who would lead them? Marshall moved immediately. He lobbied for changes to Army regulations, changes that seemed technical but were revolutionary. In 1940, Congress passed legislation that eliminated seniority as the sole criteria for promotion. Officers could now be promoted based on ability, based on performance, based on whether they could actually do the job. Marshall established what became known as the Plucking Board. The official name was less dramatic. General Officer Removal Board, 6 retired senior officers, including General Malin Craig, Marshall's predecessor as Chief of Staff. Their task was simple and brutal: review the efficiency ratings of older officers, focus particularly on colonels in their 60s approaching retirement, determine who could withstand the rigors of combat command, weed out the ones who couldn't. Marshall's instructions to the board were explicit. Critical times are upon us. Only today's performance matters. Past peacetime records are irrelevant. Medals earned 20 years ago don't matter. What matters is one question: can this officer lead men in combat under the terrific pressure of modern mechanized warfare? Yes or no? The board went to work. In the first 6 months of 1941, they removed 195 officers, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels. Men who had served for decades suddenly found themselves forced into retirement or discharged from active duty. Ultimately, Marshall's estimate was 600 officers removed before Pearl Harbor. Over 500 colonels alone, more than 1,000 officers total throughout the war. Let me tell you about one of them, Colonel William Henderson. 59 years old, commanded a regiment for 3 years, joined the Army in 1903 at age 21, fought in the Philippines, served in France during World War I, earned a Silver Star at Belleau Wood, married with 3 children, 2 daughters already grown, 1 son finishing high school. Henderson had his 20-year pension locked in. He was planning to retire in 18 months at 61. Go home to Pennsylvania, watch his son graduate, maybe do some teaching. In March 1941, Henderson received orders to report to the War Department. He assumed it was routine, maybe a new assignment, maybe a promotion. Instead, he sat across from a board of 6 generals who asked him about tactics, about mechanized warfare, about combined arms operations, about things he'd studied but never practiced. Henderson answered honestly. He'd read about German blitzkrieg tactics. He understood the theory, but he'd never commanded tanks. He'd never coordinated with aircraft. He was an infantry officer. He knew how to lead men on foot. The board thanked him for his service. 2 weeks later, Henderson received notice. Removed from active duty, retired, effective immediately. No ceremony, no farewell parade, just a letter. 38 years of service ending with a form letter. Henderson's wife cried. His son was furious. How could they do this? After everything his father had given, after Belleau Wood, after 3 decades of loyalty? Henderson didn't fight it. He understood. He'd seen the newsreels from Poland, watched German panzers slice through Polish cavalry like they weren't there. He knew the world had changed, knew he hadn't changed with it. Maybe he could have learned, maybe given time, he could have adapted. But there wasn't time. War was coming, and the Army couldn't afford maybe. Marshall never met Colonel Henderson, never knew his name, never saw his Silver Star or read about Belleau Wood. Henderson was just one name on a list of 500 colonels. But Marshall knew what Henderson represented: brave men, loyal men, men who had given everything to the Army, men who didn't deserve what was happening to them, men who had to be removed anyway. That's what kept Marshall up at night, not the decision itself. Marshall was certain the purge was necessary, but the cost, the human cost, the destroyed careers, the broken promises, the families devastated by letters they never saw coming. Marshall carried that weight. He had to. Because if he didn't feel the cost, if removing 600 officers was easy, then he was the wrong man for the job. Some were Marshall's friends, men he had served with for years. It didn't matter. The Army needed leaders who could fight the war that was coming, not the war that had already been fought. Service papers accused Marshall of getting rid of all the brains of the Army. Veterans organizations protested. Some officers claimed it was an unjust purge. Marshall didn't respond to the criticism. He just kept removing officers who weren't fit for what was ahead. Not everyone was cut. Colonel George Patton was 54, right in the at-risk age category. But Patton had the energy and drive of a man half his age. The board noted his physical condition, his tactical brilliance, his aggressive mindset. Patton stayed. Others like him stayed. The board wasn't removing officers because they were old. They were removing officers who couldn't adapt, who couldn't learn, who couldn't lead in modern warfare. Marshall was gambling everything on this purge. If he was wrong, if the officers he removed had been capable, he would be remembered as the man who gutted the Army before its greatest test. If he was right, he would save thousands of American lives. There was no middle ground. And in the summer of 1941, Marshall would find out if his gamble would pay off. By June 1941, the Army had grown to nearly 1 million men. The draft had brought in hundreds of thousands of recruits. National Guard units had been federalized. Training camps sprawled across the South. New divisions formed every month. The expansion was staggering, but quantity didn't guarantee quality. Marshall had soldiers. Now he needed to know if his officers could lead them. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, Marshall's director of training, proposed a solution. War games, massive field exercises that would simulate realistic combat conditions. Test the doctrines, test the equipment, most importantly, test the officers. Put them under pressure. See who could handle command. See who cracked. The Louisiana maneuvers would be the largest. Nearly 500,000 troops, more soldiers than in the entire Army just 2 years earlier. Marshall told McNair what he wanted. I want the mistakes made down in Louisiana, not over in Europe. The maneuvers were unscripted. Commanders had full flexibility. Plan your operations. Execute as you see fit. Umpires would grade performance. The Army would learn, and Marshall would watch his officer corps under battlefield conditions for the first time. The exercise began on September 15th in Nickfort. Colonel George Patton commanded the 2nd Armored Division. When ordered to attack Shreveport, defended by strong Red Army positions, Patton didn't make a conventional attack. He led his armored division on a massive flanking maneuver covering nearly 400 miles through East Texas. He bought up every gallon of gasoline at country service stations to keep his tanks moving. His units captured Barksdale Airfield, knocking out the Red Army's air support. Patton's tanks roared into Shreveport from the north, while infantry attacked from the south. The Red Army was trapped. On September 28th, headquarters halted the exercise. The Blue Army had completely routed the Red forces. Marshall and McNair took notes constantly. Which officers excelled, which struggled, which showed innovation, which froze under pressure. Colonel Dwight Eisenhower served as Chief of Staff for the Third Army. His planning was thorough, his execution precise. He coordinated operations across massive distances. Journalists noticed immediately One reporter said Eisenhower makes more sense than any of the rest of them. Another wrote that he had a steel-trap mind plus unusual physical vigor. Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel. Under the old seniority system, he might have stayed a lieutenant colonel for another decade. Marshall noted his name. Lieutenant Colonel Omar Bradley performed well, but Lieutenant Colonel Mark Clark showed tactical brilliance, noted. These weren't the senior generals who had dominated Army leadership 2 years earlier. These were younger officers who understood modern warfare instinctively. Speed mattered, maneuver mattered, combined arms mattered. The Louisiana maneuvers proved Marshall had been right to remove the deadwood. On December 7th, just 2 months after the Louisiana maneuvers ended, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war. The army Marshall had been building would be tested for real. The officers he had purged would not lead American soldiers into combat. The officers he had promoted and identified would. What happened next proved Marshall's purge had been necessary. Eisenhower, the lieutenant colonel who impressed everyone in Louisiana, was promoted to brigadier general in October 1941, just weeks after the maneuvers. Within months, Marshall brought him to Washington to head Army operations. By late 1942, Eisenhower commanded all United States forces in Europe. He planned and executed Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, then Sicily, then Overlord, the D-Day invasion, the largest military operation in history. Eisenhower rose from a lieutenant colonel to 5-star general, commanding millions of soldiers in less than 5 years. It never would have happened under the old seniority system. Eisenhower would have been stuck waiting for colonels ahead of him to retire. He might have made general by 1940, too late to command anything important. But Marshall's purge opened the path. Ability mattered now. Performance mattered. Results mattered. Bradley went from lieutenant colonel to field commander of American forces in Normandy. He commanded over 1 million troops by war's end. Patton, who survived the purge and excelled in Louisiana, commanded Third Army and became the general the Germans feared most. His armored divisions raced across France faster than anyone thought possible. All of them owed their positions to Marshall's willingness to destroy the old system and promote based on merit. Less than 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short were removed from their posts in the Pacific. They had failed. The Marshall system was now standard. If you couldn't perform, you were gone. Marshall estimated he forced out at least 600 officers before the United States entered World War II. Hundreds more followed during the war itself. The purge never stopped. Every time an officer failed, Marshall replaced him. The Army's officer corps became ruthlessly merit-based. Critics might say Marshall was harsh, brutal even, but the numbers tell the story. When Marshall became Chief of Staff in 1939, the United States Army had 190,000 soldiers. By 1940, it had 8.3 million. That army conquered Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan simultaneously. It fought across North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, the Philippines, and dozens of Pacific islands. It won because it had leaders who could adapt, innovate, and execute under pressure. Leaders Marshall had identified, promoted, and empowered. At the war's close, the British Chiefs of Staff called Marshall the architect and builder of the finest and most powerful army in American history. Winston Churchill called him the organizer of victory. President Harry Truman said Marshall was the man who won the war. Marshall's purge worked, not just because he removed incompetent officers, though he did, not just because he promoted brilliant ones, though he did. It worked because Marshall understood something fundamental about warfare and about leadership. The tools change, the tactics evolve, the technology advance. An army that refuses to adapt dies. An officer corps that values seniority over ability loses. Germany proved this in 1930. They had reinvented warfare with blitzkrieg. Speed, shock, combined arms. Poland fell in weeks. France fell in weeks. The old methods didn't work anymore. The officers who couldn't see that, who couldn't adapt, who couldn't learn, became liabilities instead of assets. Marshall saw this clearly. He had watched American officers in World War I struggle with outdated tactics and poor planning. He had seen thousands of soldiers die because their leaders didn't understand modern warfare. He wasn't going to let that happen again. So, he purged. He removed. He promoted. He built an officer corps that could fight the war that existed, not the war they wished existed. The Louisiana maneuvers were his proving ground, the place where theory met practice, where plans face reality, where officers showed what they could do under pressure. Some excelled, some failed. Marshall noted all of it. The officers who performed went on to command armies. The officers who struggled went into retirement or administrative positions where they couldn't get soldiers killed. It was harsh. It was necessary. And it won the war. After the war, Marshall continued to serve. He became Secretary of State under President Truman. In 1947, he proposed the European Recovery Program, known ever after as the Marshall Plan, the program that rebuilt Western Europe. That created the economic conditions for democracy to survive. That prevented Soviet expansion. For this work, Marshall received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950, the only Army general ever to receive that honor. But Marshall's greatest legacy isn't the Marshall Plan. It's the Marshall System. The idea that leadership positions should be filled by the people best qualified to do the job, not the people who have waited the longest. That ability matters more than seniority. That results matter more than time in service. That an organization's survival depends on its willingness to remove people who can't adapt and promote people who can. My father came home from the war in 1940. He never talked much about combat. Most veterans don't. But he talked about his officers, his company commander, his battalion commander, his division commander. He said they were good, that they made smart decisions, that they didn't waste lives, that they understood how to fight. He never knew why. He never knew about Marshall's purge. He never knew that the reason his officers were competent was because Marshall had removed hundreds of officers who weren't. That's the hidden history of World War II. Not just the battles, not just the invasions, but the decisions made before the war started. Decisions about who would lead, who would command, who would make the calls that would save lives or cost them. Marshall made those decisions, and he made them knowing that hundreds of officers would hate him, that critics would call him ruthless, that some would say he destroyed the army. I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine you're Colonel William Henderson, 59 years old, Silver Star from Belleau Wood, 3 decades of service. You've done everything right, followed every order, served honorably, raised a family on an officer's salary, sacrificed time with your children for your country, and now, 18 months before retirement, you get a letter, removed from active duty, effective immediately. Your career is over. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you failed, but because the world changed and you didn't change fast enough. That's what Marshall did to 600 officers. Not because he wanted to, not because he enjoyed it, but because it had to be done. Because the alternative was sending American soldiers into combat under leaders who couldn't win. And that alternative was unacceptable. Colonel Henderson went home to Pennsylvania in 1941. He never spoke bitterly about his removal. He told his son the Army made the right call, that the war ahead needed the younger men, faster thinkers, officers who understood tanks and aircraft and speed. Henderson lived until 1908, long enough to see his son graduate high school, long enough to watch Eisenhower become president, long enough to understand that Marshall had been right. Marshall died in 1959 at age 78. His funeral was attended by presidents, generals, foreign dignitaries, but the real measure of his legacy wasn't in Washington that day. It was in every American soldier who came home from a World War II because their officers made smart decisions. It was in every battle won because American commanders understood modern warfare. It was in every family that got their son or husband or father back because Marshall had the courage to purge an officer corps that couldn't adapt. The lesson Marshall taught in 1930 remains urgent today. Organizations face constant change. Technology evolves, methods improve, threats shift. The leaders who thrived in previous conditions might not be suited for current challenges. Every organization, every company, every military, every government faces the same choice: adapt or die, promote based on merit, or lose based on obsolescence. Loyalty matters, service matters, but competence matters more. Because when lives are at stake, when the mission is survival, sentiment becomes a luxury no one can afford. Marshall understood this in his bones. He knew the cost of his purge, knew the careers he was destroying, knew the families he was hurting, knew the promises he was breaking. He did it anyway, not because he was cruel, but because he was responsible for the lives of millions of soldiers who would soon be under fire. Responsible for winning a war that would determine whether democracy survived. Responsible for making decisions that no one else had the courage to make. On September 1st, Roosevelt made a decision that shocked the Army establishment. He picked an officer 34 ranks down the seniority list, an officer who had never commanded troops in combat, an officer most people had never heard of. Roosevelt picked George Marshall, and Marshall spent the next 6 years proving that merit matters more than seniority, that ability matters more than credentials, that courage sometimes means destroying what you love to save what you serve. My father died in 2003. He was 81 years old. At his funeral, other veterans came. Men he'd served with, men he'd fought beside. They told stories about the war, about the officers who led them, about commanders who made good decisions under fire, about generals who understood how to win. None of them knew about Marshall's purge. None of them knew that the competence they'd taken for granted had been purchased with 600 ended careers. None of them knew that the officers who saved their lives had been promoted over hundreds of more senior men who couldn't adapt. But I know now, and I'm telling you, because this story matters, not just as history, not just as a tale about World War II, but as a lesson about leadership that every generation needs to learn. Organizations don't fail because they lack talented people. They fail because they won't promote the talented people they have. They fail because they value loyalty over competence, because they reward seniority instead of ability, because they're too afraid to make the hard calls that survival demands. Marshall wasn't afraid. He made the hard call. He purged the old guard. He promoted the new. He built an officer corps that won the greatest war in history, and he proved that sometimes the most important decision a leader can make is deciding who shouldn't lead anymore. 600 officers lost their careers. Millions of soldiers came home alive. That's the trade Marshall made. That's the burden he carried. That's the legacy he left. And that's why 85 years later, we still need to remember his name, George Catlett Marshall, the man who purged an army to save it, the man who valued results over sentiment, the man who understood that leadership isn't about making people happy. It's about making people ready. Ready for the challenges ahead. Ready for the wars that are coming. Ready to adapt when the world changes. Because the world always changes. And the organizations that survive are the ones brave enough to change with it.